Stop the tape. Dr. Phil's voice cut through the studio like a blade. The cameras froze. The audience went silent. Every producer backstage knew something unprecedented was happening. A mother sat trembling in the guest chair, her hands gripping a sealed envelope so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Before we go any further, Dr. Phil said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, I need everyone to understand what we're about to hear will change everything. What that mother was about to confess would become one of the most devastating moments in Dr. Phil history. 2 weeks earlier, the show's producers had received a call from Sarah Mitchell, a 42-year-old mother from Ohio. Her voice on the phone had been steady, almost eerily calm. I need to tell the truth about what happened to my daughter Emma, she'd said. And I need Dr. Phil to help me do it. The intake coordinator had heard thousands of stories, but something about Sarah's tone made her immediately flag the case for Dr. Phil's personal review. Within 24 hours, Sarah was booked for what would become the most watched episode of the season. On the day of taping, Sarah arrived at the studio with only a small purse and that envelope. She declined makeup. She declined the pre-interview that guests typically go through. She only said one thing to the producer who tried to brief her. I'll only say it once. And I'll only say it to him. The cameras started rolling, but nobody knew they were about to capture something that would haunt everyone in that room. Dr. Phil began with his standard opening, trying to establish rapport. Sarah, thank you for being here. I understand you have something you need to share about your daughter Emma. Can you tell us about her? Sarah's eyes remained fixed on the envelope in her lap. Emma she turned 12 last month. She loves soccer. She wants to be a veterinarian. Her voice cracked. At least she did. Before that night. The audience leaned forward. Something about the way she said that night sent a chill through the studio. Dr. Phil's expression shifted. His trademark authoritative demeanor softened into something more careful, more protective. Sarah, whatever you need to tell me, we're here to support you. Take your time. But what Sarah said next made Dr. Phil do something he'd never done in 21 seasons. Everyone thinks it was an accident, Sarah whispered, so quietly the audio engineers had to boost her microphone. The police, the doctors, my husband, my family. Everyone thinks Emma's injuries were from a fall down the stairs that night. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dr. Phil set down his note cards. This was no longer a standard taping. Sarah, I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me. Are you saying what happened to Emma wasn't an accident? Sarah's hands were shaking so violently the envelope slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. A producer started to move forward to retrieve it, but Dr. Phil raised his hand, stopping everyone. He stood up, walked over to Sarah, and knelt beside her chair. The cameras were still rolling, but Dr. Phil wasn't performing anymore. This was real. Sarah, look at me, Dr. Phil said gently, his face level with hers. Whatever you need to say, I need you to say it clearly. Not for the cameras. Not for the audience. For Emma. Can you do that for Emma? Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't a fall, she said, her voice barely audible. I pushed her. The studio erupted in gasps. Audience members covered their mouths. One woman in the front row started crying. Dr. Phil remained completely still, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Stop the tape, Dr. Phil said again, louder this time. I need everyone out. Clear the studio. Now. Producers looked at each other in confusion. In over 2 decades of the show, Dr. Phil had never cleared the studio mid-taping. But the authority in his voice left no room for questions. Within 90 seconds, the audience was being ushered out, cameras were being turned off, and only essential personnel remained. What happened in the next 30 minutes would never be fully aired, but it would change how Dr. Phil approached every case after. With the studio empty except for a single camera operator and a counselor Dr. Phil had urgently called to the set, Sarah continued. Her voice was hollow, distant, like she was watching herself from somewhere far away. Emma had been having nightmares for months. waking up screaming every night. My husband travels for work. I hadn't slept properly in 4 months. That night, she woke up at 2 a.m. screaming again. I went to her room. I was so tired. So angry. I told her to stop. She kept crying. And Sarah's voice broke completely. I grabbed her shoulders to shake her awake, to make her stop. She pulled back. The stairs were right there. I didn't mean to push her hard. I just wanted her to stop. Dr. Phil's face showed something his audience rarely saw, raw pain. Not judgment. Not surprise. Pain. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Sarah, Dr. Phil said, his voice thick with emotion. Where is Emma now? She's in a long-term care facility. Sarah whispered. Traumatic brain injury. She's been in a minimally conscious state for 8 months. The doctors say she might wake up. They don't know. My husband thinks it was an accident. Everyone thinks it was an accident. Except me. I know what I did. Dr. Phil picked up the envelope from the floor. What's in here, Sarah? A letter. To Emma. For when she wakes up. If she wakes up. I wrote down everything. The truth. Because she deserves to know. And I deserve to be punished. Dr. Phil stood up, walked to his chair, and sat down heavily. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands pressed together in front of his face. Finally, he looked up at the camera operator. Turn that off. This isn't for television anymore. But Dr. Phil wasn't done. What he did next would define his entire career. With the cameras off, Dr. Phil spent the next 20 minutes not as a TV host, but as what he was trained to be, a clinical psychologist. He asked Sarah about her mental state in the months before the incident. About postpartum depression that had never been properly treated. About sleep deprivation that had pushed her to a breaking point. About the guilt that had been eating her alive for 8 months. Then he made a series of phone calls. First to a trauma specialist he'd worked with before. Then to a criminal defense attorney who specialized in cases involving mental health. Then to a family counselor who could work with Sarah's husband. Finally, to the facility where Emma was being cared for. Sarah, Dr. Phil said, what you did was terrible. There's no way around that. Emma is suffering because of what happened that night. But suffering alone in silence isn't justice. It isn't healing. And it isn't what Emma needs. Sarah looked up at him with hollow eyes. What do I do? First, we get you properly evaluated by a psychiatrist. Today. I've already made the call. Second, we bring in a legal team who understands the complexity of what happened. Third, we tell your husband the truth. And fourth, Dr. Phil picked up the envelope. We start working toward a day when you can actually give this letter to Emma. When she's awake. When she can understand. When there's a chance for something beyond this moment. Nobody in the studio that day expected what happened next. Dr. Phil called the production back in. The audience was reseated. The cameras turned back on. But what aired wasn't the confession. It was Dr. Phil's direct address to the camera, to America, about a topic nobody wanted to discuss. Today we were going to tape a show about a family tragedy. Dr. Phil said, his voice steady but full of emotion. But instead, I'm going to talk to you about something that affects millions of parents, but nobody wants to acknowledge, the breaking point. He spent the next segment discussing caregiver burnout, sleep deprivation's effects on mental health, the reality of intrusive thoughts that can plague exhausted parents, and the critical difference between having a thought and acting on it, and what happens when that line gets crossed in a moment of complete breakdown. If you're a parent who's ever been pushed to your limit, Dr. Phil said, looking directly into the camera. If you've ever had a thought that scared you, if you've ever felt like you're drowning and nobody sees it, you need to hear this. That feeling doesn't make you evil. It makes you human. But you have to ask for help before something happens that you can't take back. The segment ended with resources. Hotlines. Support groups. Mental health services for parents in crisis. Sarah watched from backstage, and for the first time in 8 months she took a full breath. The envelope stayed with Dr. Phil. "When Emma wakes up," he told Sarah, "and she will wake up, I believe that, you'll give this to her yourself. But not as punishment. As truth. And as the beginning of healing for both of you." 3 months later, Dr. Phil received a call. Emma had woken up. She was in physical therapy. She was asking about her mother. Sarah had entered treatment. She told her husband the truth. The family was in counseling. And yes, there were legal proceedings, but with the psychiatric evaluation, the evidence of Sarah's mental state, and her complete cooperation, the path forward was about restoration, not just punishment. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. 6 months after that initial taping, Dr. Phil brought Sarah back. This time, the cameras rolled with permission from everyone involved. Emma appeared via video call from the rehab facility. She was using a walker. Her speech was slow but clear. And when her mother appeared on the screen, Emma smiled. "Mom," Emma said, the word taking effort but full of meaning. "When can you visit?" Sarah broke down completely. "As soon as they let me, baby. As soon as they let me." Dr. Phil, sitting beside Sarah in the studio, had tears in his eyes. "Emma," he said, "your mom has something she wants to give you when she sees you next. She's been holding on to it for you." Emma nodded slowly. "I know about that night, Dr. Phil. The doctors told me it wasn't an accident. But she's still my mom. And I still love her." The studio audience was on their feet, not in applause, but in tears. After the taping, Dr. Phil kept the envelope in his office. Sarah would eventually give it to Emma in person, during a supervised visit arranged by the court and the medical team. But for Dr. Phil, that envelope became a symbol of something larger, the weight of secrets, the possibility of redemption, and the complexity of love that exists even in the aftermath of terrible mistakes. In interviews afterward, Dr. Phil would say that case changed how he viewed justice, punishment, and healing. "We want simple narratives," he'd explain. "Good people and bad people. But real life is more complex. Sarah isn't a monster. She's a mother who broke. Emma isn't just a victim. She's a person capable of extraordinary forgiveness. And healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about finding a way forward that honors the truth and creates the possibility for something better." The episode that finally aired was unlike anything Dr. Phil had done before. It wasn't about judgment. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about the most difficult question in mental health and family trauma. What do you do when love and harm come from the same person? And the answer Dr. Phil showed isn't simple. But it starts with truth. Even when the truth is the hardest thing anyone will ever say. Years later, that envelope still sits in Dr. Phil's office, empty now, its contents delivered, its purpose served. But for everyone who was in that studio the day Sarah confessed, the memory remains vivid. The moment Dr. Phil stopped being a TV host and became what he'd always been underneath, a person who believes that even in the darkest moments, there's a path toward light. You just have to be willing to walk it, no matter how much it hurts. The ripple effects of that confession extended far beyond one family. In the months following the episode, the show received over 50,000 messages from parents. Some confessed to similar moments of breaking. Others thanked Dr. Phil for finally addressing the shame that had kept them silent. Mental health organizations reported a 300% increase in calls to parental crisis hotlines in the weeks after the episode aired. Dr. Phil established a specialized resource page on his website dedicated to parental mental health, linking to emergency services, support groups, and educational materials about recognizing when normal stress crosses into dangerous territory. Sarah's story became part of training curricula at 3 major universities for social workers and family therapists. Not as a cautionary tale about abuse, but as a case study in the intersection of mental health crisis, family trauma, and the possibility of restorative justice. Emma, now 15, has made a remarkable recovery. She still uses a cane and has some memory gaps, but she's returned to school. She and Sarah see each other regularly under continued therapeutic supervision. Their relationship isn't what it was before that night. It's something different, built on hard truth rather than comfortable lies. In a follow-up interview 2 years later, Emma said something that stayed with Dr. Phil. "I think the worst thing would have been never knowing. The lie would have hurt more than the truth. At least now we're real with each other. Dr." Phil keeps a photo from their reunion on his desk, next to where the envelope once sat. In it, Sarah and Emma are holding hands. Neither is smiling. This isn't a story about easy happiness. But they're together. They're healing. And that, Dr. Phil believes, is what redemption actually looks like.